Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how to draw soft overlapping fur in pastels. Now before I get onto any fur section of a pet portrait, I do like to begin with the eyes. Now when I'm working with any areas that have a bright highlight, this would be the same for the fur or noses, anything that's more reflective, then I like to begin with my lightest colours first. And in this situation, because the highlights were bright in some areas, I've just began with white. Now once I've got those mapped in, then I can use my black Carbothello to get the size and shape of the eye accurate. Now I'm not considering any part of the iris at this stage or any subtle reflections. I can put that in after, but I do want to make sure that I've got the shape and size of the eye right first. Now once I've done this, this is where I can start to build up a base foundation. Now this is going to be something that I focus on in this video when I start on the fur. My base layer is a crucial stage of any of my paintings or drawings, and I like to make sure that I've got it as accurate to the reference photo as I can. So with that in mind, as I now progress to tackle in the fur, this is where it can get very overwhelming with the fur that does begin to overlap. Now one of my biggest tips at this stage is try not to focus on the fur that's going to be overlapping on the very top layers. Ideally we want to be leaving those more for our last layers. When working with pastels we have that flexibility of being able to layer light over dark, and we can build our layers using the right paper of course, as much as what's needed for each individual fur texture. Now just briefly mentioning the paper, this is a crucial aspect to consider. A smoother paper or a paper that does not have the right surface, tooth or texture is not going to grip the pastel correctly, and it will make adding the layers very limiting. So when I'm working with pastels, pastel matte paper by Clairefontaine is my preference. So as I'm making sure here that I'm not adding in the fur that's sitting on the very top, I'm mapping in my main lights and darks. But you'll see here that I'm focusing on creating a good level of softness. I'm blending the colours together so there are no harsh edges. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I'm demonstrating different fur textures and fur colours. And regardless whether or not I am drawing a soft texture like this or more of a wiry coat, I will still have this base layer looking soft. This is a crucial stage for the way that I like to capture realism. Now once I've got this foundation, then I can start to indicate at more of the fur texture and focus in more on my pencil technique. So at this stage here, it's really important to remember that this is not the details that is sitting on the very top. So the brightest hairs, I want to be leaving those for my later layers. I'm really starting to reinforce the fur direction, which is already starting to be established with my base foundation. But I do want to make sure here that I'm being a little bit more accurate to my reference photo. So this is where I'm starting to consider fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. Now things that are going to affect the fur thickness will be the tip of the pencil, how sharp that is. Do I want to be working with something that's a little bit more blunt and rounded? How much pressure should I be applying to the pencil? And even how I'm holding the pencil. Now holding that pencil very close to the lead is going to put excessive pressure on the tip of the pencil. So you might have more issues with thicker details. Maybe it's not quite so curved, the lines are a little bit straighter. These things can happen if that pencil is being held incorrectly. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So the placement of the highlights and shadows also influences that. But you can see that as I'm starting to curve that fur over, I'm hinting at the shape of the face. Now where the fur curves at the top of the eye, that's going to help with positioning the eye socket. If the highlights and shadows are also incorrect in their placement, then this is also going to adjust the shape and form. An example of that is if there's a highlight above the eye, that's going to help to determine the shape of that eye socket. If there is a highlight at the lower part of the cheek, this is usually then going to determine where the jaw position is in relation to the shape of the face. So everything here, those key aspects, it's really important, and I do like to get that in place at my very first layer. Now when I'm building in my layers here, I'm basically just refining that and building in that additional fur texture. But again, I can't stress enough that it's the final details that I want to be ignoring, those top hairs that I would technically touch first if I was to stroke this dog. When I'm considering my mid-tone stages here, this is where I'm helping to capture more softness. And for this fur texture, that is crucial. One of the problems with jumping into the top details too soon is that fur can then look very wiry, which of course for this breed is the complete opposite texture to what we should be aiming for. Something else that can really help to push the level of realism when working with soft overlapping fur is how that fur is captured on the very edge of the subject. So as I now start working on the white fur, I'm going to focus on making sure that the edges of the clumped fur is varied in how it changes direction. And that clumped appearance is also very important. Here I want to make it look like the fur is more grouped together compared to the finer sections of fur above the eye. Again, having variation here is going to help enhance that level of realism. So when drawing white fur, I do like to make sure that I'm not making my layers too dark if that white fur is particularly bright. Now there are many different ways to get to the same end, and depending on the reference photo and the lighting, I might not need to work with as much of a brighter layer as this. But when I do want to be more cautious with that layering approach, I find that this gives me a little bit more breathing space and makes that layering process easier. Which when working with more of a complicated fur texture like this, any slight alteration to simplify this can make a big difference to how this drawing is approached and continued to develop and build on. So when I'm working here with my midtones, I'm still paying attention to the fur direction and the way that they are grouped together, but you'll see that I'm not overlapping my pencil strokes as much. I've really worked on more of a simplistic base layer first, so that again I can simplify the way that these layers are then visualized in my reference photo. Once I've got my base foundation and primarily got my values correct, then I can start to put in more of that overlapping fur texture. And because this section of fur, it was very bright, the colours here were more limited. It certainly didn't have any of the browns, just a little bit of the hinting of the grey as you can see, but the bulk of this was white. So now that I can start working with that overlapping fur, the way that it is grouped and clumped together, I can do the bulk of this with my white pencils. And the reason being here that this works so effectively whilst also maintaining the softness is because I've made sure that the layers underneath are dark enough. Now there might be times later on where I feel that I need to enhance this contrast and make those highlights appear brighter, and one way to do that is to darken up the base foundation. So if you are working with your lighter pencils and you feel like they should be showing up but they're not, one of the first things to double check is whether or not the layers underneath are dark enough. If they aren't, then this is one of the biggest causes for the drawings to look more two-dimensional and flat. But the other end of this worry is that if the layers are too dark, then the lighter pencils on top would look wiry because the difference in the values is too great. So there is a real balance here, and it is going to depend on how white that fur is, as I've mentioned. If it was more of a grey or had additional colours reflected into that, then my layering process would be different. And I do have other videos here on YouTube that demonstrate white fur. I will link a couple of those in the description below if they're of interest. So moving on to the next stage of this drawing and beginning with the nose, the first thing I like to do here, and this would be the process for any nose regardless of the animal, is I like to map in the placement of the nostrils, the centre line if visible, and then the outside shape. This means that I'm able to get this nose looking realistic, very similar process to mapping in the eyes, and I can make sure then that I've got my proportions correct before I consider the colour of the nose and the detailing. Now when I'm working with the nose portion of any portrait, if the nostril placement is wrong, it's very obvious even if someone doesn't have a copy of the reference photo. So I do want to make sure that I've got that accurate before I move on. Once I'm happy with that, then I can start to reinforce the colour of the nose and the highlights. In this situation, there wasn't a bright highlight on the nose, so I didn't have to work with white or my lighter colours to map those in. But if there was a very bright highlight here, then I would certainly recommend to do that. As I start to build in the detail of the nose, How much detail I can add is going to depend on the size of the nose, and of course that's going to be determined by the size of the portrait. This was only 8 by 10, so in relation to how small this nose was and that portrait size, I had to focus more on the lighting here rather than detail. I had just about enough space to hint at some of the main creases in the nose, but not enough to enhance that further. But this is also something to consider. This nose is still going to look realistic because my values are going to be correct. It doesn't have to have lots of detail in order to do that. And in some situations, forcing more detail can actually make something look less realistic if we don't have space for that. When moving on to the fur that's around the nose, this is where I also needed to make sure that I didn't have my base layers too dark, but that I also extended the length of my pencil strokes. This fur here is one of the longest parts on the entire face, so I wanted to make sure that I captured that to again help with that variation and more realism. As I'm starting to block more of this in, I'm focusing on my light to dark approach, and then I'm going to pull in some more of my midtones and help to indicate more of that fur texture. Another potential problem that can arise when working on overlapping fur is that risk of muddy layers. This can happen more easily when working with pastels because of how easily they blend. That's one of the big advantages of working with this wonderful medium. But certainly when that layer starts to get put over the top, or I'm building in more of my softness here next to my light and dark colours, I have to be very, very cautious that I'm not over blending and mixing those colours together too much. And now I've built up the right softness that I want my base foundation to have, now I can start capturing more of that texture. So again, this is not me adding in my top highlights. I do want to work with my mid stages first, but here I'm focusing on that pencil technique. Now the length of the pencil strokes, it needs to be adjusted depending on each individual area. Even the fur directly above the nose might be shorter than that to the right of the nose. Adjusting the pencil technique here is crucial. When I'm working on a portrait of this size, I don't want to be trying to force in every single hair that I can see in my reference photo, but I do want to make sure that I've given that impression that they have been drawn in. So this is a combination of everything I've mentioned up to this point. The values are a key part of that. The midtones especially. If these midtone stages are skipped out, they're not captured correctly, then the top details, they are going to look too rigid. They won't have that softness that's needed, and it's going to make this fur look very flat. So I want to be making sure that I'm not trying to force in everything that I see, but that I've got the range of values that I need. And this area of the portrait is a great example of that yet again. If I try to add in all of the hairs that I can see, I will end up covering up the layers underneath. And if the layers underneath aren't able to show through, then I'm not going to have the contrast right. Because the fact that I've got some slightly darker greys, a hint of that brown at my base layer, is what's making the white details I'm currently adding show up. So going too over the top with my white here and adding in each individual detail I can see, I'll be covering up the beautiful values that I've captured at my base foundation. But here is a prime example. I wasn't happy with this narrow section. I felt like I could enhance the contrast further. This is technically a mistake in that I didn't make my base layer dark enough. I have had to draw over some of my details. But I knew that by darkening this up and adjusting my values, I'd make those details that I then add now look far better. And this is one of the reasons why I do like to work in smaller sections, because these alterations here don't seem as much of a bigger deal that they are when working on a much larger area. I find that I'm personally more likely to rush. I'm not going to spend as much time on each individual layer because I'm focusing on too much of that reference photo. So because I'm only working on these few square inches here, I can then simplify this for one stage at a time. Now that I've darkened my base, this white pencil that I'm currently using has far more impact, therefore more depth and texture to the fur, because I've made sure my contrast is exactly where it needs to be. Another bonus about working in small sections is I find I'm less likely to create the same set of pencil strokes over and over. So here I want to be trying to capture more of that natural variety that I've spoke a lot about in this video. If I create the same set of details throughout all of this portrait, then it's going to look flat again. And there's many reasons, as I've stated, at what can cause that fur to lack depth. But I certainly don't want to start to get complacent at this stage and just move my pencil for the sake of it and create random details. I want the layers and the details that I add to enhance that realism and have a purpose. If I feel like there's a section of fur that's not really showing much detail, but the rest of the reference photo is very good quality, I need to take a moment to ask myself why. Is that fur softer? Does it not have as much of the light source? Is the fur overexposed and therefore too bright? Because in those situations, I might actually make that decision to darken that layer so that I don't have as much of that blank space. This is going to depend on the effect of that drawing that I'm trying to capture, because some situations, an area of overexposed fur actually works. It adds to the drama of that portrait. But this is something that's more individual and we can assess at the time. So my plan for the chest portion of this portrait is to actually upload that as a separate video here on YouTube, because the techniques that I'm using there are very different to what I've used on the face. The softening and blending techniques are more established. The change of my values, it's something that I do want to focus on in a separate video, so that will be coming up very soon. But if you would like to draw along to the entire real-time version of this tutorial from start to finish, no sections sped up or cut out, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. And I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.